In the blistered heat of the summer of 1843, a government surveyor by the name of Tobias Dunn wandered east of Rennes, hollow with little more than a compass and a leather-bound journal. His task was simple: chart the terrain, note the property lines, and report anything of interest to the county. What he found instead was something no map had accounted for, tucked behind a sun-scorched orchard where the peaches had long withered to pits. He spotted a house, a massive, three-story structure, its roof tiled in dull slate, its wooden walls painted black as burnt coal. But what disturbed him most was not its size. It was its presence. According to Tobias, the house hadn't been there the year before. No roads led to it. No paths had been carved. The hillside was uncut. And yet, there it stood, like it had always been there. He approached, notebook in hand, boots crunching through dry grass. The porch sagged as though something heavy had lived on it far too long. Wisps of smoke trickled from the crooked chimney. Even though no sound or movement came from within, on a frayed clothesline, linens swayed gently, too gently, as if stirred not by wind but by breath. And yet, there were no footprints. No horse tethered nearby, not even the usual stink of livestock or firewood. The land surrounding the structure was undisturbed, as if the house had simply grown out of the earth. Tobias called out, once, then again. Nothing. But as he turned to leave, the silence broke. A melody floated from behind him, something plucked on strings. Not quite a harp, not quite a lyre. Soft, slow, wrong. He never looked back. Weeks later, he reported his sighting to the county clerk, insisting the house had no place on the records and no business existing at all. But what he said last, they say, chilled the entire office. It wasn't built. It was waiting. That house, the Blackridge house, hadn't appeared on any deed. It had no known owner. But from that day forward, it became the kind of place people only described in hushed tones. A structure that didn't want to be remembered, but couldn't help being seen. Winter fell like a coffin lid over Rennes, hollow in early 1844. The frost lingered longer than usual. Wells iced over. The sun rose late and seemed unsure of itself. It was during one of those dim afternoons that a stranger arrived. He introduced himself as Reverend Elias Blackridge. No horse, no cart. Just a man in a wool coat that repelled the snow like oil, and a leather-bound book cradled in his arms like an infant. The townsfolk of Briar Hollow, devout, suspicious, and fiercely territorial, were not easily impressed. They asked for his papers, his ordination, anything to prove he was what he claimed. He had none. Instead, he opened his book. Thick, hand-bound, pages dark with age. On the cover, a silver cross unlike any they'd seen. Longer, inverted slightly, with extra prongs at the arms. The elders tried to read it, but couldn't. The language curled strangely on the tongue. Elias said it was older than Latin, closer to the tongue of Eden. They asked where he preached. He smiled, slow and deliberate, and gestured vaguely to the east. "Where the trees no longer fruit and the wind has no name," he said. "That is where we gather." They refused him, of course. Too strange, too vague. But it wasn't just the book or his words that disturbed them. It was his eyes, milky pale like water in glass. Not blind, but unmoored. They didn't follow motion like they should. And when they told him no, he only nodded, as though he'd been waiting for rejection. Then he left, no farewell, no blessing. Days later, when the parish tried to record the encounter, his name was missing from the visitor logs. So was the meeting. The paper where it should have been was blank. No one in Rennes Hollow remembered seeing him arrive. But a child wandering too close to the old orchard claimed he saw a man with no shadow preaching to empty trees. That winter, 5 families from the eastern edge of town stopped attending services. When asked why, they simply said, "We've been called elsewhere." By spring of 1845, the children began talking. Not loudly, not during the day, but as twilight crept through Rennes Hollow, and the air shifted with something wetter than wind, the little ones would murmur, while gathering fireflies, while drawing in dust, while sitting silent in church pews with eyes fixed east. They spoke of a house. The house, hidden past the old peach groves, where no peaches ever grew, black as pitch, taller than it should be, windows that drank light instead of giving it back, air that smelled not of rot but of salt and something underground. One girl claimed she'd seen a woman on the porch, not standing, rocking, slowly, back and forth, her back to the world. In her arms, something wrapped in cloth, something too small to be a child, and too still to be sleeping. The town dismissed it, as towns do. Children invent things. But one boy, Emery Thatch, came back from the orchard trembling, his clothes torn, dried blood under his fingernails. He said only one word over and over until his lips cracked and his voice gave out. Downstairs. He never spoke again. His mother claimed he had sleepwalked. She kept him inside after that, refused to let him attend services, covered the mirrors in their home with blankets, refused to explain why. And still the rumors spread. About the hymns, sung in no known language, echoing at dusk, even when no one stood near the trees. About the orchard, fruitless but never dying, branches twisted like reaching fingers. Birds avoided it, so did the wind. When clouds passed overhead, they seemed to slow down. Hunters who wandered too far east claimed their dogs froze, whined and refused to step forward. One hunter returned without his hound, and with a waxy patch of skin missing from his shoulder. He would not say what he saw, only that it didn't walk, it waited. By the year's end, trails through the woods had begun to change. Paths that once looped predictably now ended in sudden drop-offs, or brambles where there had been none. Some said the forest was rearranging itself, twisting around, something it could no longer contain. The house wasn't just in the orchard anymore, it was part of it.
In the spring of 1847, Reverend Silas Dorr began to lose his congregation. At first it was subtle, fewer bodies in the pews, more late arrivals, a creeping hush that settled over the back rows. When asked, the absent families blamed fever, poor crops, or late snowmelt. But their excuses shifted from week to week, like they couldn't keep their lies straight. And it was always the same families, those whose homes hugged the eastern edge of town, closest to the orchard. Silas wasn't a superstitious man. He believed in scripture and hard inquiry, but even he had begun to notice things he couldn't explain. A chill in the church vestibule, no matter how many fires he lit. Communion wine that soured overnight. A shape once glimpsed in the chapel's reflection, not behind him, but beneath. He took to making pastoral visits, walking from house to house to check on his flock. What he found didn't ease him. One home stood silent, windows boarded from the inside, stew still steaming on the table. A child's cradle swayed as if rocked by a hand that had just vanished. In another house, every mirror had been turned to the wall. In a third, verses from Leviticus and Job had been carved, not written, into the beams, as if pen and ink weren't strong enough to keep something out. He recorded it all in his parish journal, entries written shakily, some underlined in red. The woods are changing. Not the trees, but the way we walk through them. Like they've remembered something older than us. He sent a letter to the presbytery requesting a second opinion. No one came. The next Sunday, the chapel was nearly empty. He gave his sermon anyway, but he never raised his voice. His words slipped between the pews like breath through rotted teeth. His final entry scrawled in the margins of the Psalms, "He is beneath us now." Silas stopped preaching after that. He was seen once, standing barefoot on the edge of the orchard, with mud up to his knees and a daisy crown on his head. He didn't blink when spoken to. That night, the church bell rang without a hand to pull it, only once. In the autumn of 1847, long after the church bells had quieted and the orchard trails had turned to whispers, a woman arrived in Wren's Hollow. Her name was Cora Willett, and she carried nothing but a satchel, a muslin-wrapped bundle, and eyes that had not slept in days. Her boots were caked in red clay from miles south, and her voice cracked like a page left too long in the sun. She said she was looking for her sister, Miriam. The name meant nothing to the townsfolk. But when Cora explained that Miriam had married a man named Elias Blackridge, and that her last letter spoke of a pregnancy and a house painted black, a cold silence gripped the room. One old man, the cooper, spoke first. "If she went into that house," he said, "she didn't come out with herself." Another warned her not to step past the orchard's edge after sundown. Cora ignored them all. That evening, just before twilight, she was seen walking into the woods, bundle tight in her arms. She did not carry a lantern, did not hesitate. The mist, people say, parted for her. She did not return by nightfall. The next morning, the townsfolk found the muslin bundle. It lay at the edge of the grove, placed carefully on the roots of a dead tree. It was empty, but it was still warm. Cora Willett was never seen again. Some claimed the orchard took her. Others whispered she'd found her sister and stayed, though no one could explain why her bundle would be returned, why it felt like something had been taken from it, not added. That winter, the name Blackridge began to rot. It was scratched out of land deeds, torn from church registries, painted over on grave markers. Parents forbade their children from uttering it, and when they did, sleep-talking dazed. Vacant, they were taken to the apothecary for purging. A mix of ash and juniper boiled in goat's milk, poured down their throats until the fever broke or the dreams stopped. Still, the house remained, a shadow among the hills, unaging, uninvited, watching. By the spring of 1848, the Blackridge name had become a stain, one whispered only in warnings and erased wherever ink could reach. But while the town tried to forget, the land remembered. Those who passed near the orchard noticed first. The trees were still alive, not in the usual way. They bore no fruit, no leaves unfurled. Their bark cracked and curled like scorched paper, but they stood, defiant against death, each trunk slightly bent as if bowing toward the Blackridge house. And beneath them, something stranger still, rings of salt crusted into the earth around every tree, not poured, etched, too perfect to be accidental. Dozens of them, thin white halos scorched into the soil, like someone had tried to contain what lay beneath each root. A traveling peddler named Josiah Marin was the first to speak plainly about what he saw. He hadn't meant to pass through that side of the grove, but his horse reared as they neared it, and the reins snapped clean from his hands. What he described in his report to the town constable was short. Barely a page, but enough. They weren't trees anymore. Not truly. They were marks. The kind you leave when you want to seal something in. He claimed he walked the rings until he reached the base of the hill. And there, framed by the orchard, stood the house. Still black, still silent, but no longer alone. Dozens of scarecrows, only they weren't straw. Their clothing hung damp, their bodies too rigid, like skin pulled over lattice. One of them wore a sheriff's badge. Another had a bishop's collar. One, Josiah swore, blinked as he passed. He turned to run. Behind him, the orchard gate slammed shut. There was no wind that day. He arrived in town half mad, clothes torn, salt crystals crusting the corners of his eyes. He fled west that same week and never returned. But others began to notice what he had. Wells freezing from the bottom up. Dogs that wouldn't walk east. Hearth smoke clinging to the floors like fog. And always from the hill, pale lights flickering between the trees, blue and unsteady, like dying candles in a room no one could find. The Blackridge house didn't grow louder. It simply waited while the orchard did its work.
The winter of 1848 arrived early, and wrong. The air over Wren's Hollow grew heavy, wet with cold, pressing in like the lid of a coffin nailed from the inside. Smoke no longer rose in clean columns from hearths. Instead, it drifted low, hugging the ground, crawling down chimneys instead of rising. The snow fell too slowly, each flake hanging in the air a little too long before landing like ash. People stopped speaking, not out of fear but instinct. Even inside their homes, they felt watched. Curtains were kept drawn, doors double-latched. The town bell, once rung to mark deaths and births, was left untouched. Not out of neglect, but agreement. They didn't want to call attention. Dogs refused to cross the eastern threshold, their ears pinned, their bodies low as if they sensed something beneath the frost. Some tried to dig, not with excitement, but dread, scratching silently at the base of trees until their paws bled. A few townsfolk claimed they were trying to warn us. Others said they were trying to get to something buried too deep. But then the lights started. Pale blue, flickering, like flames underwater, seen only from a distance between the twisted boughs of the orchard. They moved like lanterns but floated too high, or too low, or in patterns no hand could carry. Those who saw them swore they heard voices in the same moment. Not cries or laughter, but whispers. Prayers, they said, spoken in an unfamiliar cadence, chanted like lullabies in a language that curled the spine. It was during this time that Joseph Carver vanished. 9 years old, bright, fast, known for chasing his hoop too, far down the lane behind the cooper's shop. But this time he didn't stop. A search party found his coat caught on a bramble near the orchard's mouth. No blood, no tracks. Only the coat, damp with something dark, something that smelled of iron and lavender. His parents refused to bury an empty coffin. Instead, they lit a candle in their window every night until spring. It never went out. And when asked how they kept it burning through wind, storm and snow, Joseph's mother only said this: "We didn't. Something else didn't let it die."
In the early hours of April 3rd, 1849, just past midnight, a knock came to the door of Ruth Gantry, the town's only midwife. She'd delivered nearly every child in Wren's Hollow for 3 decades. And though age had thinned her hands, she was still sharp as frost and twice as unyielding. She lit a lantern and opened the door. A girl stood there, barefoot, no older than 16. Her linen shift was soaked in blood and amniotic fluid, clinging to her frame like wet parchment. Her lips were pale, her eyes fixed forward, unblinking. She gave no name, only said, "He sent me to fetch you." Ruth didn't ask who he was. Something in the girl's tone left no room for questions. She gathered her tools, wrapped her shawl tight, and followed the girl through the fog. The path they took should have been impassable, thick with briars and drop-offs. But the girl moved without hesitation. The woods seemed to bend for her, parting like curtains before a stage. And there, at the center of the grove, stood the Blackridge house. It looked different than Ruth remembered, narrower, crushed almost, like something had pressed against it from all sides until it buckled inward. The paint was darker than night, the windows blank as bone. The front door opened before she could knock. Inside, the air was heavy. Not foul, just wrong. Thick with the scent of wet cloth and something fermented. Wood warped underfoot. Walls pulsed faintly as though breathing behind the plaster. Ruth delivered the child quickly. It did not cry. A girl, silent, pale, her eyes wide open from the first breath. No mewling, no sound, just stillness. She wrapped the infant in oilcloth and handed her to the girl. No one thanked her. No one said a word. She was escorted out through a different door than she'd entered. The forest behind it was unfamiliar. When she returned home, dawn had not yet broken. In the pocket of her apron, a single gold coin, smooth and heavy, with no mint mark. Her hands smelled of salt for a week. She could not wash it off. She told no one what she'd seen, not the walls lined with velvet, not the shadows that moved beneath the floorboards, not the other crib in the corner of the room, still and already full. She only whispered once to a neighbor years later. That baby wasn't born, it was let out. By the summer of 1850, the Blackridge house was no longer spoken of, not in sermons, not in shops, not even behind closed doors. The town had decided in quiet consensus that some names were too heavy to carry, and so the people of Wren's Hollow did what they thought was safest. They erased it. Land deeds were amended. Church records lost in fire. Teachers were instructed not to answer questions about a certain orchard to the east. Children who spoke the name were scolded, sometimes softly, sometimes with the back of a hand. One boy had it whispered to him in a schoolyard dare, and spent the next 3 nights clawing at his own tongue in his sleep. By fall, even the most stubborn families began placing salt lines across their thresholds. Bibles were left open, not to scripture but to blank pages. Pages people claimed absorbed prayers better. And still the house stood. The trees bent a little more. The wind thinned, and the roads in and out of the grove grew less familiar by the week. That's when Thomas Elo arrived, a new school teacher from Cincinnati. Ella was young, ambitious, and worst of all, curious. He had rented a room above the cooper's shop and taken quickly to the rhythms of hollow life. But it didn't take long before the silence around the orchard pulled at him. He'd heard scraps, rumors of missing children, a preacher with no church, a family that never seemed to age. He asked questions. Most told him to focus on his teaching, but one woman did speak, Alma Glay, the town's aging seamstress. Alma said she had once stitched 2 baptismal gowns for infants bearing the Blackridge name. She remembered their skin pale, cold, too smooth, and the scars across their chests, thin, curved like a second mouth sewn shut. She had never been paid, but for 7 mornings after the second gown was delivered, she found a single white feather on her doorstep, always the same, always pointed east. She left town that winter, never came back. Ella wrote all of this down in a personal journal. He also began to dream of a room with no ceiling, a cradle that rocked by itself, and hands that reached up through the floorboards, not to grab but to beckon. By the summer of 1850, the Blackridge house was no longer spoken of, not in sermons, not in shops, not even behind closed doors. The town had decided in quiet consensus that some names were too heavy to carry, and so the people of Wren's Hollow did what they thought was safest. They erased it. Land deeds were amended. Church records lost in fire. Teachers were instructed not to answer questions about a certain orchard to the east. Children who spoke the name were scolded, sometimes softly, sometimes with the back of a hand. One boy had it whispered to him in a schoolyard dare, and spent the next 3 nights clawing at his own tongue in his sleep. By fall, even the most stubborn families began placing salt lines across their thresholds. Bibles were left open, not to scripture but to blank pages. Pages people claimed absorbed prayers better, and still the house stood. The trees bent a little more, the wind thinned, and the roads in and out of the grove grew less familiar by the week. That's when Thomas Ela arrived, a new school teacher from Cincinnati. Ela was young, ambitious, and worst of all, curious. He had rented a room above the cooper's shop and taken quickly to the rhythms of hollow life, but it didn't take long before the silence around the orchard pulled at him. He'd heard scraps, rumors of missing children, a preacher with no church, a family that never seemed to age. He asked questions. Most told him to focus on his teaching, but one woman did speak, Alma Glay, the town's aging seamstress. Alma said she had once stitched 2 baptismal gowns for infants bearing the Blackridge name. She remembered their skin pale, cold, too smooth, and the scars across their chests, thin, curved like a second mouth sewn shut. She had never been paid, but for 7 mornings after the second gown was delivered, she found a single white feather on her doorstep, always the same, always pointed east. She left town that winter, never came back. Ela wrote all of this down in a personal journal. He also began to dream of a room with no ceiling, a cradle that rocked by itself, and hands that reached up through the floorboards, not to grab, but to beckon. He hadn't said the name aloud, but the house knew him now. By November of 1850, Thomas Ela was unraveling. His handwriting, once clean and deliberate, now scratched across the pages like branches against glass, uneven, rushed, desperate. In the margins of his journal, he began drawing circles, always incomplete, always broken at the same spot along the eastern edge. He told no one why. He had stopped attending Sunday service, kept his curtains closed even during the day. His landlord, Mr. Felter, said he hadn't heard movement from upstairs in days. But the room smelled of wet linen and iron, like someone had steeped old nails in boiling water. One night, a girl in Ela's class, Celia Goff, came home in tears. She said the teacher hadn't spoken all lesson, only stood by the blackboard with his hand pressed flat against the wall, breathing slow. She claimed the chalk in his other hand moved without him, drawing a crib again and again until the board turned to dust. The next morning, Ela was seen digging behind the schoolhouse. He said nothing when asked, just kept digging. His hands were raw, fingernails blackened. He dug until the blade of his shovel struck wood, not a root, not a rock. A box, no longer than a bassinet. He pried it open, empty, but lined with black velvet, damp at the corners, and stitched with a symbol that no one could translate. The box was burned that night, but the flames gave off no smoke. Just a sound, a thin, high whine, like metal singing. Ela became convinced there was a second cradle, deeper underground. Something older, something that rocked even when the earth didn't move. He began sleeping under his desk, whispering to the cracks in the floor. One night, he carved 3 words into the wall above his cot. She is listening. No one knows who he meant, but Alma Glay, now living in Berwick, Hollow, reported waking that same night with blood in her ears and a vision of a child's hand reaching up through the floorboards of her bedroom, fingers stiff with frost, curling slowly inward. She never spoke of the Blackridge name again. And Ela? He stopped writing. His final journal entry contained no date. In the early days of 1851, the air in Wren's Hollow grew sharp and whistling, like breath pulled backward through a keyhole. No birds returned that spring. No buds appeared on the trees. Even the insects, the gnats, the wasps, the black-dotted beetles that clung to the orchard's roots had vanished. What replaced them was sound, but not the kind that traveled by air. This was deeper, vibrational, a low hum, only perceptible when standing near the old trails that led east. Some said it was like standing above a cello being played beneath the ground. Others said it wasn't sound at all, but memory, some buried signal rising up through the soil, rattling the bones of those who dared to listen. The few who followed it said it led always to the same clearing, the heart of the orchard. But the trees had changed again. They no longer leaned toward the house. They leaned inward, bending toward a point that did not exist, as if drawn by gravity from a star no eye could see. In their center, the grass had died in a perfect circle. 12 pines stood there, twisted and barren, forming a ring. Locals began calling it the 13th Psalm, a name whispered in jest at first, until they realized no one could remember giving it that title. It simply existed. One man, a drunk named Pell from down by the mill, boasted he'd counted the trees himself. That same night, his left eye ruptured in his sleep. The socket was filled with white feathers and a single thin twig, charred at one end. He lived, but never spoke again. Not a single sound. The town's choir director, Mrs. Bostwick, claimed she heard children singing near the orchard one morning. She followed the sound until it stopped abruptly at the tree line. There were no children there, but carved into the bark of a tree was a short phrase in a crooked childlike hand. She sings to the roots. That evening, every hymnal in the church spontaneously opened to Psalm 13, though no breeze moved. Ella was gone by then, but something had taken up his place. By midsummer of 1851, Wren's Hollow was suffocating in its own silence. Families began moving west, quietly, without farewells. Shops closed earlier each week. Children no longer played in the fields. And those who stayed stopped looking east. They told themselves the house was just a shadow, that the trees had always leaned like that the strange sounds at night, metallic humming, infant gurgles, whispers that clicked like moth wings, were tricks of wind and sleepless minds. But deep down, they knew something was changing the land. Not growing, not invading, remembering itself. The first to notice were the millers. Barrels of grain, freshly ground, began to arrive at the cooper's shop with patterns pressed into the flour, swirls, spirals, eye-like symbols. Mr. Felter thought it was mold at first, until he scooped his hand through one and found a perfectly round stone, eye buried in the center. The iris carved with a second pupil. Then came the bread. One family, the Harlans, claimed their daily loaf emerged from the oven, with a mouth baked into its side, open wide, crust cracked like lips mid-scream. They tossed it into the river. That night, their eldest son awoke with teeth marks along his collarbone. The baker stopped baking. By August, wood grain patterns across town began shifting. People reported seeing faces in the beams of their homes, eyes staring, mouths slack. When covered, the grain patterns moved beneath the paint, reforming overnight. Some claimed the faces smiled when no one watched. The church pews warped. The altar split once down the middle, clean and bloodless like a birth canal. Only the apothecary remained untouched. Or so people thought. One morning, a boy named Elias, not Blackridge, but the name alone drew notice, wandered in complaining of headaches. He opened his mouth to speak, and the apothecary saw something behind his tongue, a tiny pine seed, rooted in soft flesh, already sprouting. It was removed. But the boy never spoke again, not out of pain, out of obedience. He said later, through writing, that the voice told him to hush, because the roots were listening now. And in the fields just outside town, a new circle of trees had begun to form. 13 again, but this time no one planted them. By early September of 1851, the town bell began to toll again. No one rang it. It started at odd hours, never on the hour, never in rhythm. One clang at 3:07 AM, another at 12:16 PM, then silence for days. The bell itself, when inspected, showed no movement. The rope was still, the clapper unmoved. But the sound carried across Wren's Hollow, like a heartbeat forced through rusted iron. It wasn't clean. It shivered. It seemed to come not from above, but below, as though tolling from a hollow space beneath the chapel floor. Some claimed the sound wasn't metal at all. It was wet. Inside the church, the hymnals began changing. Not all at once, not visibly, but when opened, some pages bore words that weren't there before. Cursive curling backward, lines written in a language with no known script, but which left the eyes aching and the reader's tongue dry as chalk. Reverend Haskell, Silas Dorr's uneasy replacement, attempted to burn the altered hymnals. The fire wouldn't catch, not until he cut out the pages with a blade and buried them behind the chapel. That night, the soil rose, just slightly, and all the earthworms in the garden wriggled out, curling into spirals before dying in sync. Then came the letters, delivered without postmarks. No sender, no wax seals, just crude parchment, folded once. Inside each, a message written in that same spiraled language. Some were delivered to shop doors, others slipped beneath floorboards. One was found tucked into the mouth of a newborn calf. Every letter ended the same way. She is forming the second mouth. A local teacher, not Ella. But his replacement, a woman named Ruthlyn, attempted to decode the messages. She said the script wasn't symbolic. It was phonetic but not human, not designed for a tongue, more like something remembering how to speak through someone else's mouth. She collapsed mid-lesson after attempting to pronounce the last line aloud. Her jaw locked. Her pupils dilated. When she regained consciousness, she wrote on the chalkboard without looking. The bell is not ringing. The bell is calling, and it will not stop until the second voice answers. The church was abandoned the next week, but the bell did not stop. By the end of September 1851, the silence that had once gripped Wren's Hollow began to unravel, not with shouts or screams, but with sound where there should be none. At night in the windless dark, people heard it. A breath, long, wet, rhythmic, drawn in from nowhere, let out without effort, as if the orchard itself had grown lungs. It came from the east, always east. In the apothecary's ledgers, a new illness began to appear, aphasia without fever. Victims stopped speaking, not from fear or pain, but forgetting how. Words left them mid-sentence. Nouns vanished, then names, then memory. And yet, somehow, they still made sounds. Not speech, not even animal, but replications. A child was heard mimicking a door hinge for 6 hours without blinking. An old woman, long mute, began imitating the church bell exactly, including the delay between strikes. When questioned, they wept, but said nothing. And then the girl came back. No one remembered her arriving, not even those who had seen her. The one born in the house, delivered by Ruth Gantry in the night. She looked older now, still small, still pale, still silent, but her mouth had changed. People said it was hard to look at, not for any deformity, but for something your eyes didn't want to understand. A curve too perfect, lips too smooth, like they weren't made to move but to open only once. And behind them, teeth, too many, too even. A milkman, upon seeing her, dropped his pail. When asked what he'd seen, he could only stammer. It smiled with the wrong part. That night, his home burned down with him inside. His neighbors claimed they never saw flames, just the color of flame, spreading sideways through the wood. The girl was last seen near the old schoolhouse, standing beside a second cradle that had not been there the day before. It was made of white wood veined with dark red lines that pulsed when touched. Inside lay a single bundle of feathers, still wet, as if freshly plucked from something alive. Someone asked her name. She did not speak. She only opened her mouth. And from somewhere far below, the bell answered.